So it just so happens that in 1918, in the farmland of Charlotte, North Carolina, Charlotte used to be farmland, okay, back then, there was a kid named William who was born, and his parents' names happened to be Frank and Morrow. They lived a quiet country life. It was simple. There were hills. And as the story goes, there's a boiled custard that William really liked, and he'd drink it up by the quart. In 1934, just so happens that a Baptist revival came to town, led by a guy named, get this, Mordecai Ham. Mordecai Ham. And William's parents don't attend the revival, but one of his father's co-workers doesn't convince his father to go, but he convinces William to go to this revival that's going on. Revival lasts a week or a little bit more than that. And it's powerful teaching that night, powerful teaching on sin, salvation. Little William goes forward and has a transformative experience with Christ. In fact, he surrenders his life to Christ. He goes home, and that evening he says, "Oh, Mother, today I've been saved." It's a big change in his life. And so it just so happens that William started out as a Fuller brush salesman, convincing people. He was charming, he's persuasive, and he convinces people, you really need a brush. Doesn't seem like an easy task, does it? You really need a brush. But he hones skills, and he attains skills that he would need later for his calling in life. And then things shift for him again when he enrolls at Florida Bible Institute, begins to learn the Bible, begins to learn how to interact with it, begins to learn how to study it. And it just so happens he has a mentor. His name is John Minter. And there's a conference. It's a funny story. William's young. He's inexperienced. He hasn't preached before. There's a conference. And then that evening, John is asked to preach. Now, I don't know how it came to the last second and they didn't have somebody to preach. But John Minter is asked to preach. And he says, "I'm sorry, I have to decline. But William can preach." So little William's sitting there, and he volunteers young William. And it turns out William had memorized a sermon out of a book. It wasn't even his sermon. He had taken one to memory, so he goes and he recites it that evening. And it's kind of this awkward debut. This awkward debut for William. So that night's just the beginning for William, though, because he goes on to lead some of the most impactful, some of the most sustained, some of the most widespread revivals that this country, or really the entire world, has ever seen. Becomes a spiritual authority, becomes a spokesperson, actually, for the faith. And he becomes an advisor to not one, not two, not three, 12 presidents. Get that. You got to live a long time, number one. And you got to have really good rapport with people to be an advisor to 12 presidents, because it just so happens that little boy named William is known with more familiarity to us as Billy Graham. It's Billy Graham. So yeah, and there you go. There's an early picture of Graham at these revivals that he called crusades that just grew and grew. So there are decisions we make, everybody. There's places we go. There's experiences we have. There's things that happen to us, big and small, and they can seem like just an unconnected string of events. Things that just so happened. These just so happens in our lives. They can seem chaotic and random and ordinary. Does your life ever feel like that? Just some chaotic events, right? A lot of people can identify with that. What if I told you God's telling a story in your life? A story that's not about what you've done, what you're going to do in the future. God's telling a story about you and about the person who you're becoming. He's telling a story about the person you're becoming that makes sense of all the just so happens kinds of events in your lives. It puts them together, weaves them together, such that the hard times that you've endured, and by the way, God does not cause those hard times. We don't believe that here. God doesn't send hardship into your life. But the hard times that you've endured, he uses those to build up perseverance, and he uses those to build up empathy. And you ever notice, you go through hard things, you go through difficult things, but that builds a kind of empathy in you for other people. You ever notice that? And you can identify with them, and you can better minister to them. That's what he's doing through the hard times. Or that job that maybe seemed useless to you. it actually built in a kind of honesty, and it's building in a kind of integrity into your life. I remember my father talking about early in his life, and he had a seminary degree at this point, wanted to become a pastor, gets a job at a hospital. He's just doing different kinds of maintenance things, and they give him this assignment of painting this room, and it has to be color-coded, and I don't remember why, but different parts of it have to be color-coded. And I remember him saying, like, nobody sees this room. You ever painted a room nobody sees? You ever had that kind of experience? Either literally or metaphorically. You paint a room nobody sees. And he said, well, I decided that I'm going to do that for the glory of God. I'm going to do the best I can for the glory of God. So God can use those things that you see as useless or ordinary. Even success. You know success is fleeting? Did you know that? You do big things. People recognize you. What happens a year down the road, 5 years down the road? Those things are fleeting. So even success, everybody, can teach us humility. So what if the just so happens in our lives are oftentimes God at work? Imagine that. The just so happens, the mundane, the ordinary. What if those things are actually, can you at least admit the possibility this morning that those are actually God at work? He's weaving together a narrative of us being moved into the place, into the spaces, into the kind of life that he has for us, and he's working all things together. And so what if we could have new eyes? New eyes. Some people literally want new eyes. What if we could, even deeper than that, even more importantly than that, metaphorically, spiritually, what if we could have new eyes to see the world and the events in our lives such that we move from seeing the ordinary and we move to seeing the extraordinary because God's in it? And what if we move from the just so happens, you move from the just so happens, the coincidental, to God is at work. God is on the move. Would that be a shift worth making? I'm asking you. Is that a shift worth making? All right, I think so too. We're going to look at a story, a great story in the Bible. It's called the Book of Ruth. You can go ahead and flip there if you want to. We're going to be in the Book of Ruth. But it begins with tragedy. It's a story that begins with tragedy. It's a woman who loses her husband. She's got 2 sons, and then she loses both of her sons, all in a short span of time. And you'll see they're in difficult circumstances to begin with. And then this happens to them. Lots of themes in the book. The book is in part about response to tragedy. How do we respond to tragedy well and in a way that we grow, in a way that God can speak to us and minister to us? It's about that. It's about loyalty. It's about commitment, sacrifice, taking risks, risk-taking, family, responsibility, all this stuff. But looming over the book, over all of that, the book's about God's activity, what God's doing. It's about God's compassion. And it's about, here's a big theological word for you. It's about God's providence. About God's providence. What in the world is that? Well, it's God working in the world to bring about his will, to bring about his purposes. That's what it is. This book's about God's providence. And what's really interesting is God is mentioned in the book in passing. He's not mentioned as an actor in the book of Ruth. Those of you who have read it, you ever notice that? God is never mentioned as doing something or in acting some way. But he haunts every page of the book. It's a holy kind of haunting. God's presence haunts every page of that book, I'll tell you what. It's about how God lives, moves, and acts in seemingly ordinary people in the details of lives. That's what's fantastic about the Bible. It's about ordinary people. Why is that good? Well, who are we? Who are we? We're ordinary people. Yeah, all right, we're ordinary people. That's right. All right. So God cares for even us. So I'm just wondering this morning, can we have new eyes? Can we put on a new set of eyes that God wants to give us? Eyes of faith to see God's working everything together for the good. So the book of Ruth. It's one of 2 books in the Bible named after women. What's the other? Esther. Oh, very good. Look at you. Look at everybody on their toes this morning. It's the book of Esther. It's the second book named after a woman. It's about a family, and they're living in Bethlehem. They're living in Bethlehem. Father's name is Elimelech. Mother's name Naomi. And they got two kids, two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And it starts like this. It is a hopeful book. It is a redemptive book. Starts really ominously. And it says, in the days, this is Ruth 1:1, in the days when the judges ruled. Now that's a little cue. That's a time of turmoil. That's a real time. Go back and read the book of Judges. It's craziness. It really is. That's a time of turmoil in the life of the people when the judges rule. And there was a famine in the land. Now, famine oftentimes introduces tragedy in the Bible, on one hand, but also introduces when God's going to work, when God's going to do something mighty. So when you hear there was a famine in the land, you shouldn't just think, that's tragic, people are going hungry, that is tragic. You should also be cued in, what's God going to do? There's a famine in the land. What's God going to do? What's he going to bring out of this? What great things might be in store? But it starts like this. It starts when judges are ruling, and there's a famine in the land. So a man in Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and two sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Now, Moab admits some men, they're not exactly friends. They're not exactly friends. To be an immigrant in Moab meant you're ostracized, you're pushed out, you have a minimal set of rights. So you got to think, how dire would the situation have to be then for this family to move to Moab? It'd be a pretty bad famine. All right, going to Moab's not like going to Canada. Okay, it's different. So that's what's going on. Here's what I want to do. I think it's going to be fun this morning. I got a video to show you. It's an extended video. It's a little over 7 minutes. Grab your popcorn. All right, it's a little over 7 minutes. But it's an overview. Some people call it the Bible Project. Anybody heard of the Bible Project? Make just these fantastic videos. It's really meant to help us be more literate, to understand the Bible better. It's going to give us an overview of Ruth. Today's an overview of the entire book. I got a couple questions, a couple points for you after this. But let's look at it, and before we dig in, we're going to take a Sunday on each chapter. It's organized. You're going to see this in the video. It's organized in a chapter. This just so happens theme, they bring this out again in the story of Ruth, who is a youth, Ruth the youth. But it's really good stuff. So check it out. Let's get an overview, and then we'll come back and we'll talk.
The book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line, in the days when the judges ruled. And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God. And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Oved, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
All right, very good. Thank you to the Bible Project. Actually, that's a website really worth checking out. The Bible Project, I think it's just thebibleproject.com. And they're really passionate about helping us understand the Bible better and knowing it and having it, sink down in and change us. In fact, they allow you to just forego the copyright issue and just show these in the service. So it's fantastic. Great group of people. That's an overview. There you go. There's the book of Ruth. It's fascinating. It's wonderful. It is God at work. And there's two ways of viewing the experiences that make up our lives. There's two ways. There's the just so happens and the God is at work. There's successive, random, unrelated events of the story where God's redeeming and he's shaping us. And let me tell you what, we're gonna see the world in one of these two ways. It's just part of being human. You and I are gonna see the world as just so happens or God is at work, and it's gonna affect everything we think about it's this big. This is not dramatic, it's this big. It's gonna affect everything we think about our identity and our meaning in this world and our purpose in it. The way we think about the events and the things that happen to us. Are we merely a collection of random, one-off, forgotten events, meaningless struggle and anxiety and depression? Are our lives nothing more than it just so happens? Or are we valuable in the eyes of God? Does God love us deeply? We sang that song earlier. It's really good stuff. Your identity is you're a child of God. Is that who we are? So much that he works in the lives of people like us to weave together a story of redemption. To weave together a story of redemption and all our experiences, why we're here. And it gives us a purpose to be part of the kingdom, such that all our struggles, all our passions, all our experiences are shaping us into the person that God created us to be and to walk with him into eternity. That's the other way of looking at the world. It just so happens God is at work. Ruth going back to Moab, which seems like it would have been a fine thing for her to do. Clearly a self-interested thing for her to do. Versus Ruth staying with Naomi and watching a truly redemptive story unfold. God in the details. So starting next week, we're gonna come back to Ruth chapter 1. Let's fast forward a few hundred years. Let's look at the book of Romans, where Paul's trying to get us to see this same kind of thing. The book of Romans chapter 8, starting 28, says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son, so that he would be the firstborn among many brethren. And these, the ones whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. Now that's a mouthful. That's a lot. Theologically, people they debate about this passage. What's it mean? Shelve all that for a minute. What does this passage mean? That succession of all these things God's going to do in our lives. It means he is involved in the details, in the particularity, in the ordinariness of your life. Not just people like Billy Graham. Clearly God's hand is there. That same power, that same presence that was involved in the seemingly just so happens, the ordinary events of his life, he is involved in your life. He cares about your life. He cares about the person who you become. And he sticks with it. all that succession of things, being predestined, being called, being glorified, all those things, he sticks with it until you are this thing called glorified. That's the other side of this life, everybody. That's when God fully shapes you into the person he created you to be. But you're not just sitting around waiting on death. You're even now being shaped into that person. That's what this tells us. Here's the question I want us to ponder. Not just this morning, over the next 4 weeks, the 4 weeks after that. Here's what I want us to think about as we work through Ruth and as we see this really fascinating story. Can you believe? This is missing is, sorry. Can you believe that God is at work for the good? Can you believe that? Can you believe that God is at work for the good and he's able to bring redemption amidst all the circumstances in your life, no matter how difficult they seem, no matter how ordinary or mundane they seem, whatever they are? Can you believe that God is at work in them? Can you believe that God is in the details? Say the devil's in the details, right? Well, this is different. God's in the details. Can you believe that? Can you believe God's at work in the difficult? God's at work in the mundane? Do you see the power in this? Do you see the power in this? It shifts literally everything. In fact, I want to close with 3 things. It does 3 things. If this is the case, if you can answer these questions in the affirmative, yes, I believe God's at work in even the details, even the little stuff in my life, even the confusion that I feel now. Well, number 1, it means we're not going to be crushed by our circumstances. Doesn't mean we're not going to have difficult circumstances. God told us we'd never have difficult circumstances. It'd be kind of hard to believe God. But we're not promised that. But if all this is true, it means we're not going to be crushed by them. Tragedy's real. Difficulty's real. We're going to face mountains that seem insurmountable. And I don't need to tell you that because so many of us, that's where we're at. That's where we're at. We're struggling with illness. Maybe you have a chronic illness. There's a few things that get you down, I'll tell you what. Then watching people who have a chronic illness or having one yourself. You got death of a loved one. It's huge. Anxiety, depression, absolutely epidemic. Or you've got relational meltdown. Relationships just, they've deteriorated. They're gone. Relationships that once were there, they're gone. Troubles at work, whatever it is. These things are very real. God doesn't cause them. They come along in our lives. They do. They're real. But amidst unspeakable tragedy, Ruth refuses what seems like a clear route to just go back home, to cut her losses. These were things that just so happened in my life. Cut her losses and go home. But it's really interesting, and it's worthwhile, and we're going to do this next week for a little bit. Thinking about the character that Ruth had going into this tragedy and how that begins to come through. Her willingness to sacrifice, her loyalty, her perseverance, all these things. It's just a tremendous story. Character's not about what happens to you in life. Character's not about what happens to you in life. Character can't be about what happens to you in life because life is full of things that from our perspective are unexpected. It's about how we respond with God's guidance, with God's presence. It's about how we respond to the things that happen to us. Ruth, and even, you see Naomi changes her name to bitter. We see that, and she struggles through this. But even Ruth and Naomi, they keep going. They demonstrate a kind of faith when no one would have blamed them. Would anyone blame them for just crumpling up in a corner, and just spending their days there? That's it. I'm gonna be on social media. I'm gonna be a gamer, and I'm just gonna shut myself in a room, and that's it. It's self-medicating for the rest of my days. Would anyone have blamed them for doing that? But they keep moving out of faith in God. They're mourning, but they're not crushed. They're not crushed because his hand's at work. And we aren't crushed by circumstances when we know that the God who is at work in them, we know that the God who's at work in those circumstances is bigger than those circumstances. Gotta believe that. We gotta believe that. It's bigger than those circumstances. All right, that's number one. Number two, if God's really at work in the details, then we don't see mundane experiences as a waste of our valuable time. It's a waste of my time. This is a waste of my time. Can't wait to get on to the good stuff in life or whatever. You can spend a lot of your life feeling like that. Do you know that? That is kind of a waste. That feeling about things means we don't see the mundane as a waste of time. God can prepare you for the ways he wants to change you from the inside out, and the ways in which he wants to use you to show the winsomeness and the goodness of the kingdom. He can use you in those things while you're selling fuller brushes, like William. He could do that. In fact, he may use you for his purposes while you're selling fuller brushes, not just in spite of it. You may be right where he wants you to be. You may be right where he wants you to be. I know that may blow your mind, some of the situations in which you find yourself this morning. You may be right where he wants you to be this morning. And you're going to miss out on the goodness of that calling. Hear me. I'm speaking from experience. Through my 20s, this was the theme of my life. You're going to miss out on the goodness of that calling in that place if you're constantly looking forward to when God moves in a truly mighty way. You're going to miss that. And you can get stuck in a place where you're constantly looking forward to what it is you think God ought to do. You ever have ideas about what you think God ought to do? Man, tell you what, Lord, if only you had created the whole universe and saw the whole thing from point A to point B, you'd see you should have done this. To believe that God is at work in the details of our lives, in the circumstances, means not only future ones, not only dwelling on past ones, it means he's working in these circumstances right now. You know how absolutely freeing it is to live in the moment, right? That's the life God has for us. He's moving in these circumstances right now. In fact, number three, this one shouldn't be a surprise after the second one, it means there are no truly mundane circumstances. There are no truly mundane circumstances. If an extraordinary God is working in the midst of the ordinary, then all circumstances are extraordinary. All of them are. They're all times to know God. They're all times to be shaped by him. They're all times to see God at work and to bless others through him. Now, what's ordinary about that? I get external, just viewing things externally, it can seem really ordinary. What's ordinary about that? What I just described. God at work, shaping us, knowing him, seeing him at work, blessing others because of him with his love. What's ordinary about that? Collecting wheat. That's a turning point in the story of Ruth. Collecting wheat, that may be a window into a whole new redemptive world for us. So here's the challenge. I want to give all of us, this is for me too. I want to give all of us the challenge over the next 5 weeks. Let's ask God to give us a new set of eyes. A new set of eyes to see our circumstances differently, such that we don't see them as wasted moments, or we don't see any of these moments as irredeemable. Who believes? Can you believe that? That there are no circumstances that are irredeemable. I get there are circumstances that can seem very difficult from a human perspective. How in the world is this ever going to be turned around? But once upon a time, Ruth and Naomi go walking back home to Bethlehem, emotionally and spiritually empty-handed, with death all around them. So can we see that there aren't wasted moments? There aren't irredeemable or merely mundane circumstances. Let's ask God to give us eyes to see him at work, making all things extraordinary and showing us that the valleys in our lives, I get it. You're in a valley this morning, I get that. But that they're redeemable. Can you see him at work in conversations with loved ones? I had one of these this weekend myself in our extended family. And I want to see God at work. I want to see it. We need to see it. Can you see him at work in the lives of people who are struggling? Can you see him at work at your work and at your play and recreation? Can you see him in a walk in the woods and a chance to reach out to people at church? Can you see him in trial and tragedy? Can you ask God, can I begin to see hidden spiritual realities that are all around me? There's a spiritual world that with the coming of Christ, with his resurrection, now intersects with ours. Did you know that? The spiritual world's not up there and we're down here. It's among us. Even when Jesus prayed, by the way, when Jesus prayed, he would have held his hands up and he would have looked up. But that would have been a way not of acknowledging that God was far away, but that he was right here with us. Jesus was looking up at the things here and the atmosphere here. God is here and he's with us. Can we know that there are spiritual realities and see them? Then can we ask him, now how do we respond to this new world that we now see? There are flavors and colors and all these things I just never saw before. And now I have new eyes. Now I see them. How do I respond to it? A world that's broken, but we don't have to fix it. Because now we got these new eyes and we see God is at work fixing it. So how do we join with them? How do we join with them? How can we see what Boaz saw? That God's calling us to be part of his redeeming work. How do we respond to that? Because there's no conversation, there's no assignment, there's no work, there's no opportunity that's too small when the bigness of the kingdom is among us, and the bigness of the kingdom is what's at stake. So I'm challenging all of us. I'm asking you, read this book. Read the book of Ruth. It's just 4 chapters. If you can read it over and over again, read it over and over again. Ask God to give you new eyes to see the spiritual realities that are all around us. Immerse yourself in it. Ask him to speak to you. And I'll tell you what, he is going to meet you there. All right, Lord, so we ask you for this. We ask you for new eyes to see the goodness of what you're doing. Even when we're in the dark of a valley, we know you're there. We know you walk with us. We know you give us everything we need. We live into that. We live into that this morning. Amen.